One of my favourite books in the Old Testament is that of Daniel. It's a great account, well told, of Daniel and his friends thriving against all the odds. Daniel versus the great king. 3 good young men against a furnace. Daniel against hungry lions. And that towards the end of his life. And like all good stories that are gripping and well told, there's a central character who is, we are told, good looking and physically fit. Daniel. It contains along the way accounts of immorality, deception, false imprisonment, injustice, and it even contains scary bits. A dismembered hand writing on a wall at a king's banquet, and a king behaving like a wild animal and living in the fields. What a great story. What a great account. But the most important thing about this book, for me anyway, is that at the heart of it is the character of Daniel and his friends. But over that, over and above Daniel and his friends, is the providence of God. Though it's not always obvious to those in the drama. As you read the book of Daniel, God seems strangely absent at times when you'd think he might step in otherwise. Let me read to you the opening of the book of Daniel. During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they're well versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. And so the story goes on. It's quite a kind of, it's a very true account, but it's one that's really quite frightening. Where is God when all this is going on? Think about Daniel some more. He'd lived a privileged existence in Jerusalem, that great and wonderful, beautiful city. He worshipped God faithfully, regularly. He was committed to God. Even when many around him had given up on God, Daniel was faithful. He'd go to the temple every week and admire the beauty of it. But then, this young man's world was shattered. He was probably no more than a teenager when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon besieged Jerusalem. He'd been threatening Jerusalem for many years as the Babylonian Empire became stronger and stronger. So he besieged Jerusalem, and then, horror of horrors, the pagan king took God's city. The pagan king Nebuchadnezzar took the city of God. That sounds bad enough. It sounds like maybe God had been caught off guard. But listen to what we read in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 2. The Lord gave Nebuchadnezzar victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple. See, Nebuchadnezzar couldn't have taken Jerusalem unless God had allowed him to. What is God doing, allowing this to happen? On the ground, for Daniel, it looks like God has deserted him, whereas in fact God is actually right there. Nebuchadnezzar took the treasures from the temple, from God's house, and he put them in his pagan temple. What an awful thing to do, to dishonour God in that way. And he took Daniel and his friends back to Babylon to serve him in a pagan court. If ever there was a time to ask, where is God? Surely this was it. Faithful Daniel and his friends were separated from family, never to see them again. Separated from their home city, never to see it again. Separated from the temple, God's place, never to see it again. And they were made to serve a pagan king. Everything taken away, except for Daniel and his friends, except their faith in God. And all this, we are told quite clearly, had happened under God's providence. But the bigger picture saw God at work through Daniel and his friends. Despite what it felt like to them, God was at work by his providence. Things did not go smoothly for Daniel or his friends. They had ups and downs in their lives. Terrible things happened to them. They were threatened, but they remained faithful to God. And through that, their influence on the great kingdom of Babylon was incalculable. Their faith in God meant that God used them for his glory. Now, things are pretty well upside down just now, aren't they? There's hardly anything as perhaps we feel it should be. Churches are closed for the first time in history. Reflecting on St. Botolph's, we are celebrating 900 years this year. I say to the children when they come, primary school visits, I say this church is 900 years old and there's been a service every Sunday here for 900 years. I won't be able to say that anymore. That's the world upside down, isn't it? We're confined to our homes in a way that none of us have ever known before. We live in a free country where we're free to do whatever we want to do, but not now. We're confined to our homes, and it may seem like God has forgotten us. Whatever's happening in our family, we may lose relatives, or people may become ill. But God has not forgotten us, regardless of what we may feel. When you feel that God may have deserted you, think about Daniel and all that was taken away from him, and the way God used his faithfulness to bring glory to his name. See, God is in charge. He will be glorified, though we may not see it and we may not see how. He will be glorified because he is God. Psalm 99 rightly says, "The Lord is King. Let the nations tremble."